Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan. I am in San Francisco at Grace Lutheran, www.gracesf.com, where we have worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. And our Bible Study That Doesn't Suck happens every Wednesday-ish, around 9:30-ish. You can watch us live on YouTube or go to justlutheran.blogspot.com. And you can watch the archive version of the videos. And then when you look down below on the blog, you'll find the Bible text and some of the links to things that we were talking about. And today we have a special guest.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself? I don't know.
I am Louise Buckles. I am a seminary student at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in my second year, and I am Pastor Megan's teaching parish student.
And you don't even want to explain why you're upside down?
Oh, I am upside down because my computer has a glitch and I have not fixed it yet.
Glitch.
Yeah.
So Louise has a glitch. Or did we do it on purpose so that you'd remember that she's a baby pastor in training? And the baby part doesn't have anything to do with age, just has to do with being in school. It's fun. Anyway, Pastor Dan might drop in at some point. He's been having trouble connecting on, so we'll find out if that happens. So there are a couple of different readings in the lectionary text today, and for those of you who haven't been to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck before, lectionary is a 3-year cycle of Bible readings that happen in a lot of the mainline denomination churches, so Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, Episcopal. There are some variations amongst those denominations, but for the most part, many congregations have the same Bible readings each week, and they were selected and curated by old-timey, mostly white folk. And so sometimes they're thematic. Sometimes it's just about moving you along to the next moon cycle ritual that we're going to celebrate, whether that's Easter or Christmas or any of those other things in between. And today is one of the weeks when there are choices. So you can pick between different texts, and pastors get a little bit of a choice about which ones they like the best. Oftentimes that will happen when there's like a bummer of a text and a happy text, and so you can choose if you want a sad text or a happy text. Other times it happens just because there is not agreement on how to do the theme. It seems like ye oldie time Bible cutter lectionary folk picked the theme of God's not fair, or is God fair? How does God work? That seems to kind of be the through line of some of these texts. And the through line also seems to be that what everyone used to think was the exact right way to worship God is changing. And so if you are someone for whom your faith is dependent upon the Bible never changing, or God never changing, or prophets never changing the way they're doing things, this might not be the Bible study for you. If you are curious about parts in the Bible where God has a change of heart or a change of mind, if you want to imagine that if God does it, it's perfect, that means that it's all still fine. You can use that narrative. My particular belief is that being a parent is hard, and sometimes you shift up how you parent when your children misbehave or when your children don't get the point of what you're trying to tell them, and that God does that, and that it's pretty normal and natural for parents to kind of shift things up a little bit. So one of the first readings that is a choice for the Hebrew Bible is a Jeremiah text, and I'll put it down here when it's on the justlutheran.blogspot.com. It's a lot of talking about how God is frustrated with creation, and in this text it's interesting because God seems to be frustrated that they're confused all the time, which in other texts of the Bible, like in Exodus, God seems to get that people are confused all the time and just kind of adjusts accordingly. But this seems to be a text where God has had enough and is tired of the confusion. And it also argues that God is frustrated because the people are nomads and they keep moving from place to place and they won't stay put, which maybe is how a parent feels when their kids are in the grocery store running off in different directions, but is a strange one because if you read the book of Exodus, God's the one who sends them off on their wilderness journey where they are wandering around. So it's hard to know what's entirely going on in the text, but we do know that this is a text of God being frustrated with people, and likely that the things that the things that Jeremiah is saying that God is frustrated about are likely the exact same things that Jeremiah was frustrated about. So if you've ever been really annoyed and you just are just full up, I don't know why you'd feel that way this political season, but if you were ever full up with shifting, changing ideas, or feeling like the world is going into a terrible place and it's got to be made great again, maybe these are themes that you can relate to. I don't know. That's all I really have to say about the Jeremiah text because it doesn't really speak to me as much as some of the others. Do you have any thoughts about it, Louise?
No, I think you pretty much summarized it. It's God's frustrated.
Yep. The Sirach reading is an alternative. We don't read Sirach a lot. Sirach is kind of like a wisdom text where it's usually like happy clappy, Holy Spirit loves you. But this particular short passage is kind of interesting because it equates people who give sacrifices to God as people who are trying to bribe God to get out of trouble. And in previous Old Testament texts, God has said that God wants sacrifices. There's an entire story about Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac. But this is a text that the wisdom or the Holy Spirit comes to the people and says, stop giving me sacrifices. It bugs me because you're just trying to pay me off for the dumb things you do. Doesn't say it in that exact quote. Obviously, that's a Pastor Megan translation. But so this is a time of shifting kind of what people were wanting to have happen in the world, and it might have been jarring. So this is just one of probably a million times in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible journey, when God's got something new to say. Behold, I am doing a new thing. And people go, oh, what's the new thing? Instead of complaining. They probably did complain. They probably just didn't write it in the Bible. Anyway. So that's the short bit of Sirach. Got any thoughts about sacrificing things, Louise?
No, I think sacrifice is a hard one to understand sometimes because it's never fun when you're the one who's having to sacrifice something.
Well, and it's also never fun when jerky people are saying, oh, the terrible thing you're experiencing, you totally don't need help because God likes it when you suffer for God. Annoying. And not biblical. Well, maybe partially biblical, but not in a place that didn't change kind of through time. So the Old Testament text that I like the best is the text that is for the Episcopal reading this week. It's also listed as one of the alternatives that you can skip to in the Lutheran form of the lectionary. And it is from the book of Joel. And there's kind of a cool thing that's happening in the book of Joel. Joel is a prophet, but not the kind of prophet that we might normally think of. So like, think of like Jonah, who's going to tell everyone they're terrible. And he's so mad. He doesn't want to do it. He hides under a bush and gets swallowed by a whale. And he's like, finally, I'll tell people they're terrible. But he really, really didn't want to. Everything terrible had to happen to him first. So typically in a Hebrew Bible, prophet would say something like, you're terrible. God's going to get you. Burn, bloody, burny, burn, right? Turn or burn, repent, right? That's a typical kind of Hebrew Bible prophet thing to exclaim. However, what is really unique and kind of fun about what's happening here in Joel's text is that Joel is arguing that his job as a prophet is to make more profits, right? He seemingly could care less about if people are following all the particular rules, because he's driven by this desire to shift or maybe deflect the shame that the people of Israel would have. So imagine people who are mostly farmers. It's easy to do if you're in the Midwest. Right now is harvest time. And my mom was telling me yesterday about how on the farm, she doesn't know when she's going to see the farmers who are out harvesting. They usually leave before the light comes up and they come back well after it's dark. And she tries to have lunch and dinner ready on time, but just who knows when they're going to show up. Their whole life right now is consumed with the harvest and with farming. And so imagine that you are in an economy that is similar to that. Your whole life's worth is kind of dependent upon this economy. And instead of living in a time like we do in the United States post the Depression, when the entire farming system collapsed because there wasn't support systems, there wasn't crop rotations, there wasn't incentives for particular types of crops to be planted. And whether or not you believe that farm subsidies are a good thing, one of the things that they do is they take away how economically devastating it is when there is a natural disaster or like locusts or too much rain or not enough rain or tornadoes or anything like that could wipe out your entire crop. And so farmers tend to have to do a little bit of math. So they have to figure out what the stock market says particular crops are going to be worth, but they also have to figure out which crops, if they plant them in their fields, can they get paid for them, even if there's a terrible natural disaster. So you want to have enough fields that you know for sure that if it floods or if there's a drought, that you will be able to not go under that year or not have to declare bankruptcy or sell off some of your equipment or your animals. And so those crops that usually are protected by the government, you get kind of a steady amount of money for them. It's not a huge return. It's kind of the equivalent of putting your money in a CD. Like, you know for sure you're going to get your money at the end, but it's not going to be a large amount of interest. And then there are some other fields that you might choose to put in the stock market because there might be a larger return. And it literally is the stock market because corn prices and soybean prices and wheat prices in the United States are determined by the stock market. And so you can choose the amount of fields that you're going to risk it all on, like in Las Vegas. So you want to have enough fields that are safe, that no matter what terrible thing happens with the weather, you're going to break even that year. And then you have all these other fields where you might choose to have a more risky hand, like a more risky stock in the stock market. And that might prove to be a really great investment where you get a really good return at the end of the year because the weather behaves and the crops behave. And depending upon the number of other farmers who also picked that same crop, right? Supply and demand can shift. And so there is a lot of kind of economic risk that goes into farming. So that's kind of how kind of contemporary farming happens. Ancient farming was a lot more difficult because when the weather shifted, right, you didn't have crop rotations. So you could have sandstorms that could come through and wipe out your entire crop. There was locust storms that would come through and wipe out your entire crop. There was too much rain and there was too little rain. And so even one of those things happening that year could be enough to just ruin your entire farm. And these were poor folk who were just kind of making it. They traveled a lot, so it wasn't like they had tilled the soil so well that there were no rocks in it, right? And they're doing this all by hand. So it's a very, very risky farming endeavor that they're a part of. And on top of that, they believed very strongly that when the locusts came, it was their own God punishing them, right? Because when they left Egypt, locusts and floods and droughts and famines and plagues and grain being infested was a part of their God rescuing them from slavery. So not too long before that, all these terrible things were a sign that their God was powerful and strong. But then when it's just you experiencing these natural disasters and these farming hiccups, it's a lot less fun, because then when something terrible happens to you, not only do you have to figure out the economic ramifications to your farm when some sort of natural disaster happens, but you now have to deal with the religious shame of the whole thing. Because if you live in a system where it's like, nanner, nanner, poo, poo, my God's stronger than yours, because my crops are plentiful and you're not in charge of the rain, and when the rain comes or when the rain doesn't, then you have a very difficult situation happening. So what Joel does is he removes this idea that God's favor is dependent upon the weather system, right? Joel essentially says the Doppler system is amazing, but it's not that great, right? The weatherman might think he knows what's going to happen, but he has no clue what's going to happen. And so Joel argues that anyone who calls to God gets to be saved. Everyone, no matter how terrible, no matter if they helped with the planting, no matter if the wilderness goes terrible and runs amok on your farm. So everyone gets to be saved. This is one of the core kind of Lutheran tenets. So if it sounds familiar, that might be why. Everyone gets to be saved. If you're terrible, if you sin and you like it, right? God is with you. And so there's this idea. So how do we know that God is powerful? If we used to know that God was powerful because these terrible weather things happened and it took care of our enemies, now if weather is not the indicator of whether or not God is strong, what do we look for? And some people call it a recognition formula. It's this idea that God is so powerful that you don't need the weather to prove it to you. So Joel says, you will know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I, the Lord your God, and there's no other God. So there's this idea that the power of God is going to happen because of our knowing. Because we know that God is there, God's going to become known to us in powerful, strong ways that aren't like the beginning of The Wizard of Oz with tornadoes and earthquakes and terrible things like that. I don't think the 500 Club has gotten that message or believed it. And so know that there are different types of Christianity who have different places they stand on whether or not weather disasters are God's revenge on the planet. Joel says it's not God's revenge on the planet. And Joel is, again, trying not to just be a prophet who yells at people and tells them to change their ways, but is trying to make disciples, essentially, trying to make more prophets in the world. And so I have this little statue here. This is in lieu of Pastor Amanda being here, because this is from the Portland Japanese Garden, which is Pastor Amanda's favorite place ever. This is a Bodhisattva statue. So it's a Buddha who, instead of removing themselves from the suffering of the world, which is the ultimate goal for many Buddhists, the Bodhisattva gets a tiptoe near the edge of enlightenment, but doesn't disappear from the planet, which is what they think happens when you gain true enlightenment and you're separated from the world. The Bodhisattva stays around long enough to bring everyone else to. The Bodhisattva's motto is, if you can't all come, I'm not going. And so the Bodhisattva tries to make sure that all people have access to kind of this freedom that the divine mystery is seeking for people. This is a similar theme that Joel is talking about, this idea that all people can untangle themselves from the misery and the suffering of the world, that you don't have to live in the fear and shame that you might have attributed to God in the past, but God doesn't want any of us to live with fear and shame, and so we should be released. It's very similar to what Moses was up to when he said, I know that I am saved, and my job now is to take on the sins of others so that they too can be free. And it also is very similar to what Jesus was up to when he said, I'm not just going into my own death, but my plan is to save other people. And if you believe the Apostles' Creed, Jesus not only saves those who believe, like Joel is asserting here, but Jesus goes for 3 days down into the depths of hell and even saves the people who didn't believe during their lifetime. And so there's this idea that Jesus ain't letting go of nobody, that everybody kind of gets to go. Again, there's lots of different types of Christian faiths that believe different things. But I think this is an interesting way to kind of look at Joel's text and to look at what might be needed in our own world, and will be a way to look at what's being talked about in kind of the Greek text that we're going to get to in a sec. So what do you think about the idea of not just only being happy and claiming your own religious kind of rewards and trying to ensure that everyone gets a piece of holiness and sacredness?
So I totally agree with that, and I love that idea. And one thing about this text too that I appreciate is when it says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Peter quoted that when he was explaining to the crowd what happened at the day of Pentecost. And so Peter brought parts of this text and that understanding that God is there to save everybody into the New Testament.
Dun, dun, dun. And for those who are wondering, I use the terms Hebrew Bible and Greek Bible. It's just talking about the different languages that they're translated into. Some people who are Jewish have, when they hear words like Old Testament and New Testament, feel like you're denigrating kind of the Torah by talking about it as being old or outdated. But there's, here on Bible Study That Doesn't Suck, there's no intent to suck in the words that we are using. And so it's just differences that different people use. But if you're someone who's never been to church or to Bible study before, I just wanted to explain that we are in fact talking about the same thing. And there's no right or wrong way, or there should be no sense that if you use different words in one conversation or in one context, that it's a terrible, terrible thing. Yeah. So some people use Greek Testament and Hebrew scriptures. Some people use Torah, which is the first 10 books of the Bible. It just depends on the context that you're in and what kinds of interfaith conversations you want to be a part of. So that's just a little explanation for those who wonder about words. Should we talk about Timothy? Let's talk about Timothy. Timothy. Most people remember the book of Timothy because it's one of those texts, because it's written by Paul, but it's a text to Timothy, who is a young up and coming pastor probably. And most people remember Timothy because if they ever went to like Bible camp when they were little, there's a lot of great texts like, don't let people despise you because you're young and stuff like that. What is also interesting about this is that Paul seems to be writing this letter when he is at the end of his life, when he is probably going to pass on. And so it's kind of like a legacy letter. So it's like the old generation passing on to the new generation how they want them to be into the future. So Timothy is probably a toddler pastor because he's ordained. So a little bit, if you want to know where he is on his old man pastor status, that's what he's up to. And Timothy is a third generation Christian. So he's not like Paul, who is a convert late in life after doing terrible, terrible, terrible bloody slaughter things to Christians. And he's not like the disciples who are in their learning space about what God is up to and what Jesus is up to. The weird thing about this, so you would think that Timothy is someone who's maybe a little bit more mature in his faith. He's a couple generations post Jesus. However, the texts that are written by Paul were written, scholars believe, earlier than the Gospels about Jesus. So even though the Jesus stories are written to evoke the senses of the time when Jesus was alive. They were written probably 150 years after Jesus was dead already at the soonest. And these texts from Paul were written maybe 70-ish years, 50-ish, 60, 70-ish years. Is that the right answer, Louise? Something like that? Okay,
yeah.
somewhere in there they were written. And because when it comes to numbers, I'm always usually wrong because I am dyslexic. So just imagine that these texts are written roughly 80 to 100 years earlier than the stories that we have about Jesus. So it's a weird time flip because it's so much easier to think about, well, if this is a third generation Christian, then it's probably less accurate and less like the time of Jesus than something that was written by the disciples or by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or any of the texts that were proposed to be written by the disciples. That doesn't mean that the stories weren't shared through oral history or that there were earlier versions that might have disintegrated and we just don't have copies of them. We're just talking about the text that we still have today and how kind of biblical scholarship is going. So the interesting thing, so remember that Paul comes to faith. Paul is someone who is murdering Christians. He's running around like a zombie who wants to eat flesh, murdering Christians because he believes that they're terrible. He's a part of the oppressive establishment. And then the story goes that Paul had this vision of Jesus or an apparition of Jesus, or Jesus literally appears to him on the road, and Paul has a conversion experience. So Paul has a conversion experience. He decides he's not going to be the oppressor anymore. He's going to go out and he's going to convert people to the Christianity that he once was murdering people for. So it takes him a little while, and it's difficult because you can imagine that there are some people who assume that Paul hasn't changed, that he's trying to trick them so he can murder them still. That there are other people who are like, screw you, dude. I've been a Christian this whole time, and you have a vision, and all of a sudden you're the expert on who's a Christian. And that is not something that is unique to Paul. John Calvin has a conversion experience, and all of a sudden he's a Christian. And then like 2 years later, he writes 4 volumes of the entire works of Christianity. So it could be that their conversion experiences make them have a unique perspective that the whole world needs. It could also be that when people are new to discovering something about themselves, they want to read everything about it, and they suddenly become the greatest expert in that subject because they have deep feelings about it. But just remember, well, and I'll just say that this is the way that some people feel about Caitlyn Jenner, right? She becomes trans. 4 seconds later, she's the leading expert on trans issues. So sometimes it's our feeling of excitement that makes us feel like we know everything about something. Other times, there are people who have been a part of the faith forever, and they're so bored and boring that having new life in the world is helpful and useful because at least they're doing something interesting and they still have their passion, right? So like young love is the most passionate. It can also be that these are people who are going to act strongly in whatever direction they are pointed at. So for example, if you were a billionaire and you gave all your money to Democrats because you thought they could help you with your real estate issues, and then you have a change of heart, who knows why, and then you become even stronger a Republican than the Republicans. You become so Republican, it makes the Republicans uncomfortable and want to disavow you. There are some people who are going to like this excitement and come to rallies and turn out in greater numbers because they're like, finally gets it and says all the things, and they're excited. And then you'll also have other people within the same party who are like, where have you been? We've put in our dues. We're the experts. Why don't you care about our opinions? And this is something that happens in every revolution. If you think about Black Lives Matters folk and civil rights leaders who are like, why don't you care about the rights we've gained? We have wisdom to share. And they're like, we have a new passion. If you think about different groups in the LGBT community who are like back when they were marching with suits and ties, and they're like, we've got this all figured out. We're gaining our rights. And then young kids were like, we're queer. Get out of here. Like, act up. So there have always been people in revolutions who are stronger and out of control and on that borderline of scary, dangerous. And so I think of Paul and Augustine and new revolutions as on that line of scary, dangerous, in an anarchy kind of way. And there are always good things that come out of that, because the more aggressive and provocative one side is, it moves the middle, right? Because if we move more radical, then the middle shifts over and what seems reasonable changes. We're seeing that now, perhaps in the political election. What we thought was normal for a campaign is different today than even last week. And so think of Paul in that kind of vein of, I'm new, so I'm in love with it, and And so what Paul is arguing, though, is not all that different from when he wasn't a Christian, right? He was like murderous, suffering, battle crazy. So his description of how you love God and how you find favor with God is just as battle crazy. He talks about faith being a battle. It's a struggle between us and them. And he talks about it knowing that he is on the losing side of the battle because he used to murder all the Christians and he found it easy, right? So this is a weird, you have to take Paul's stories with this. It would be like if someone who was fighting for ISIS all of a sudden joined the United States Army and they knew exactly how to defeat ISIS. There would be always a part of you that's like, I don't know if we're going to trust you all the way, no matter how much they proved themselves. And the more that person started suggesting things that started to sound like suicide bombings, even if it was a good idea that was the way to win, you'd be like, I don't know about this. It kind of seems like we're adopting the other side's tactics on this. So that's a few thoughts about what's going on here with Paul. One of the cool things is that he doesn't entirely jump into the slaughter violence bandwagon fully. He adopts this idea of there being crowns and laurels and pines for faith, which is a reference to the Olympics. So Paul is arguing that you can become as famous and awesome for your faith as Greeks were considered in the Olympics, which is kind of cool. And that still hasn't caught on yet, but maybe it will in the future. So anyway, that's a couple of thoughts. What do you think about Paul being a slaughtery jerky pants? I like, by the way, you haven't been to Bible study that doesn't suck before, but I sometimes like to toss the conversation to other people through the weirdest vein that could get them in trouble if they answer. So feel free to pull a politician and talk about what you think is interesting. Bloody slaughter.
And you know, that whole vein of, and this Paul's at the end of his life and he's talking about himself being poured out as a libation. And so, you know, I've done the work, I've done all this, and now I think I've done a good job. I fought a good fight, he says. And so he sees his life as having been that fight for what he believed was right and what he knew was right. The fight against what he had been fighting for in his younger years. So
which is crazy.
Yeah.
Puzzle a little bit crazy. Crazy good sometimes, because he's the one who goes kind of all in on that idea that we talked about earlier, that idea that everyone can be saved if they just declare it. Excuse me.
Oh,
so he kind of goes all in on that God saves you and you don't have to do any work to make it happen part. But he also goes all in on some other wackadoodle stuff that's strange. Let's move on to the Luke text, because we got to keep to our time frame this week, particularly because I have to skidoo. The Luke text is talking about, it's supposedly a parable, but it doesn't really seem like a parable. It seems like an Aesop's fable, sort of, I suppose, or just a description of things that were being seen in the world. And so you have one faithful person who says, "Hooray, I'm not terrible." And you have another person who says, "I'm terrible." And God likes the one who admits that they're terrible over the one who doesn't admit, or who says, "Thank you that I'm not terrible." Which, on the first reading of the parable, seems kind of obvious and seems like a really fun way to be like, ha ha ha, those who are terrible to us in life are going to get it in the end, and we're going to have justice, and hooray, because heaven's going to be awesome. That would be really great if you didn't remember that rabbis, which the Pharisees were, rabbis typically, when they pray, like when they pray at the Western Wall, or they're doing their weekly prayers, are just reading from Scripture. So they're not usually doing the kind of prayer that we think about when we think of prayer today. Today we think of prayer that's like, "Dear God, thank you for the food." Like, that was not how this rabbi probably would have prayed. The observant Jew wouldn't be praying that way, which makes this text stranger, because if the observant Jew happens to be praying Scripture, most likely Psalm 117, which says, let me tell you, I'll read it for you. "If you try my heart, if you visit me by night, if you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. As for what others do, by the word of your lips I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped." So if this rabbi is praying Psalm 117, then Jesus is indicting the Psalms as something you should pray. That God likes someone who thinks they're terrible over someone who prays the Psalms. And that's an interesting parable if you are someone who believes that every word of the Bible is exactly 100% true. Because if every single word of the Bible is 100% true, you should be able to read any part of it and God should be happy. And if Jesus is God, Jesus should be happy. So what happens when God likes someone who is humble over someone who is praying a psalm? And the indication, the way that Luke is telling the story, is that the person who is praying the psalm, the rabbi, is a hypocrite, because they're not being honest. You haven't walked the path all the time. Your foot has slipped. We've all done at least one thing that pisses God off, and that's for certain, right? And that's a clear tenet of Jesus, particularly in Luke's gospel, because Luke errs on the side of the poor and the vulnerable. But these are David's prayers, and David wrote them down, and they're supposed to be the ultimate prayers that we can read in times of need when we want to pray stuff. And in fact, most congregations every Sunday will read the Psalms as a communal prayer, and that's why they're done in call and response, right? There'll be parts in bold, and the whole community will read them together, and there'll be parts where a reader reads them, because they are thought to be prayers that are appropriate for the church. So if they're appropriate, why is Jesus mad about it? Louise? And solve all the mysteries of faith. Go.
Yeah. I think what Jesus is reacting to is this attitude of "I am better." And so he's taking the prayers of Psalms, but it's also the attitude of his heart. And he's thinking, because of this, I'm better than this person sitting over on the sidelines. And I'm better than the person who sits at my door and begs because he doesn't have any money. And so I'm better than you. And because I'm better than you, I can pray these Psalms and God is blessing me and he's not blessing you. And I think that's a lot of it right there is because just like going back to the harvest thing that you were talking about earlier, because your crops didn't get rain, so God's not blessing you.
Yeah, but it's problematic. It's problematic that he's just reading a psalm and people assume that he has a judgment, because the same kind of, like, we are projecting a judgment upon the rabbi.
Yeah.
And we're mad because we think the rabbi thinks he's better than other people, but we've just done the exact same thing to the rabbi by presuming he's terrible in the parable.
That's true.
And I suppose it only works if you think that Jesus is always right, to assume that it can't be a wonkadoodle parable. The beautiful thing that comes out of this text, I think it's a mystery, and then perhaps it's a failed metaphor. It's, for me, it reminds me of times when you try to make a point about how much better you are than other people because they believe that they're better than other people, right? So I'm so much better than rich people because they only think they're better than other people, right? There is an innate hypocrisy that is in that statement and in saying it that way. Yeah. The beautiful gift of that is that Jesus is very human and like us. Yay! Right? Yay. So all of us try to make a point sometimes, and maybe we don't make it the right way. And there's other examples of this, particularly thinking of farm metaphors. There's a Bible study that doesn't suck, farm edition, where I talk to my stepdad, who is a farmer, and I tell him about Jesus's explanations about how farming works. And my stepdad is so great in these videos because he 100% believes that if Jesus says it, it becomes true because Jesus says it. But everything Jesus is saying is about farming is totally wrong, and the metaphor is terrible. The best example is the parable that Jesus talks about of not picking out terrible people from society. The idea is that you let the wheat and the weeds grow together in the same field. The difficulty with that is if you let the weeds and the wheat grow in the same field, the weeds take all the nutrients and the wheat becomes inedible and without any substance or nutrition. And so it's a parable of everything becoming blander, which maybe describes our church and what's happened. But it's a terrible farming metaphor, right? You don't come in and like figure it all out in the end with God's judgment, which is what the parable suggests, because it just means that everyone is terrible at that time. The wheat would also be weeds because it wouldn't be edible. And you'd have to throw away everything that came from the farm. And so unless God is saying, I don't like any of you, even those of you who think you're great and those of you who think you're terrible, it's an unfortunate parable of Jesus. And I believe that because the faith of God's chosen people comes through wrestling. Last week's text was the wrestling of Jacob, that we get to wrestle with some of these texts and we don't always end up with the right answers. And sometimes it's more fun just to question them because it makes us think and ponder things that we normally wouldn't have thought. And we can go right back to believing the same old kind of interpretation of them. But the part of Bible study doesn't suck is that sometimes we look at things upside down. And right now, Louise has to talk so that you can see that she is literally upside down.
Yes, we look at things upside down and trying to put them right side up a lot of times doesn't work. It's better and funner to just ask the hard questions and then wrestle with it.
That's right. And that's why Louise hasn't fixed her computer. So if you were to believe Jesus's parable and not ignore the crazy hypocrisy and illogic in it, the cool thing that happens in this parable is that there is an idea that systems that seem permanent, like economic and social systems that seem fixed and unchangeable. So if you feel helpless because you're never going to be wealthy because the system is rigged and and tax structures are structured so that rich people get richer and poor people get poorer, and wages aren't adjusted in a way that makes it so that people are able to get ahead or ever pay down their crushing debt from credit cards and student loans and all of those beautiful things, that this is a message from Jesus that in God's eyes, the fixed social and economic structures on earth isn't how God sees or notices or cares for people, or how God figures out who's saved and who's not saved, that those issues. So if you might be the most powerful, impressive person on earth, but you're not necessarily the most powerful, impressive in God's eyes. And there's this idea that God cares for the poor, maybe in a special way, that the first will be last and the last will be first. And then the difficulty of that message is it contradicts one of our previous Hebrew Bible readings that explicitly says there is no preference for the poor in God's eyes. So this whole week of readings is nutso bonanza face, because if you read all of the readings, each one would contradict the next. And perhaps that's the lesson of this week's Bible reading, is that God is way more complicated than cut and paste of 10 verses from here and 10 verses of there. Or maybe just ye oldie white, mostly white folk who made this lectionary sucketh, mucheth. It's hard to tell. I don't know. That's what I have to say. What do you do when you see that things all contradict each other in text?
When I see the contradictions in the text, it makes me think of the fact that, you know, God is more complicated than this linear line that we try to put him in. And he really kind of lives a little bit outside of the box that we try to put him in, or her in. And that, you know, sometimes this box is not always a good thing, because as humankind, all of us are different, and there's many different views and many different understandings of what's going on in the world. And taking the time to listen to the different understandings really enhances who we are and makes us better. Yes.
Bodhisattva says, someday you will understand that you can be free of all this suffering, that you don't have to make sense, that words are riddles, and in the silence you will find happiness. And if you don't yet, I'll wait. That was the Bodhisattva's message. The end. Anyway, well, thank you for those who stuck with us all the way through to the end. You are a trooper and a champion. I hope that you will continue to wrestle with some of these ideas. And if you have the opportunity to be in a children's sermon this week, oh, please ask questions, because these are the best texts. It's like when pastors try to explain the Trinity to third graders, it just ain't gonna happen. And so this is a great, if you've ever wanted to play Stump Your Pastor, or you have a pastor who like double dog dares you to ask questions, they're going to trick them. This is totally your week. So go fight, win. Anyway, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you next week.